How would you describe your role? What is it that you do?
Well, I think my role is really in a small startup, whatever needs to be done, right? And second is really identifying all the different ways that we can grow the company. And so, for to begin with, I think it's looking at what was working now, what was working when I started with the company, so that we can continue to kind of hit that bullseye and expand it. And then how we look at growing into outer rings, both in channels and segments, and then ultimately growing into larger strategic partnerships. So really trying to look at overall growth of the company without losing sight of what is working for our existing customers today.
So, usually, on the show, we typically speak to the founder. And so the fact that you were hired, to do this role it's a very clear sign that Barnal Tech is really growing, because that's a really good sign, right? Like, where that's just generally, like, in the early stages as a founder, you wear 50 hats, and then eventually you realize that you can't do it, and then you need to sort of segment different roles. And I would say, I mean, I guess a lot of people would have different opinions, but growth is the fundamental thing in any business. So I'm sure, like, a lot of people today are now really curious, in terms of growth, what exactly they could be doing. So before we get into that, I think let's add a little bit more context too. Tell us about Barnal Tech.
Absolutely. So Barnow essentially automates the monitoring of remote and mobile assets with an AI-powered surveillance platform. So if you think of Nest or something like, or not Nest, Ring, when you put it on, people put it on their front door and they're looking at, and that's all Wi-Fi powered. It's something like that, but it's for areas without infrastructure. So when you're thinking about rural assets and in the middle of nowhere where there's no infrastructure, no power, no internet, so we deploy cameras with a software solution so that people can keep an eye on their property.
Right. And so you've got a very clear value proposition there, and you've got a very clear, because, part of what you mentioned there was essentially talking about what makes you different, right? And I think that's I think one of those essential, like, 101 things which I think a lot of people forget when they're thinking about pitching a product. It's like you have to describe exactly why you are different, and part of that is really understanding who your customer is, because that's when you know what they value. And in this case, you mentioned rural; they don't have much infrastructure, so this is like our value prop. Tell us about your customer. Is this something which I mean, clearly, because you designed the product, it went in with customer in mind, but is that assumption of who your customer was different from when it began? Is this something you can speak to, or like it's always been very?
No, absolutely. I can speak to this. Our customer is exactly who it was intended for in the beginning, and I'll tell you why. Our founder grew up in farms, working on farms, his family farms, in rural Nebraska and Wyoming. And so he grew up riding a horse and checking fence lines and water tanks and driving the perimeter of the farms. He then went to the Air Force Academy and became a fighter pilot, where he had access to all kinds of surveillance technologies, right? And so when he had those two experiences, just like, why in the world are we still driving around farms and ranches to check on these things when we could have a different solution? And so I think, like any good business, you can only experience sales and growth if you're solving a real problem for real people. And so he then began, when he was in grad school at Wharton, he started Barnow to serve the farm and ranch communities. And so that has been our beachhead. That's been our gateway kind of into our customer base. We have over 700 customers, and largely in the ag market, but not all farmers and ranchers. And so as any product, that was who we have been targeting. That is who we're focusing on right now. But within that, you also end up with other customers who are monitoring other things. We have customers who are in construction, in rural law enforcement, in utility infrastructure. So when you think about all the different people that need that solution, there are a lot of industries impacted.
Yeah, and that's really where I was going with that question. So maybe it wasn't phrased well where I said like, is it different? But
Mm-hmm.
you tend to start off with these assumptions on who you're looking to serve, and now it's really interesting that you've got people like folks from construction and law enforcement that have come in. Has this changed your thinking at all in terms of how you're marketing yourself or branding yourself, or you know what I mean? Because now you're clearly seeing different segments of the market, and as part of growth, I guess you also want to communicate to these folks too, right?
Yes, yes, and that's some of the stuff that we can address as we talk about our website and how we're starting to target those individuals. I think it's really important that we continue to serve our existing customer base. So, like I said
Mhm.
earlier, not alienating those people, but then how do we start to segment and test other audiences, whether it be, even within the farming and ranching industry, you may target, um, you know, people that are looking at for security purposes. Others are looking to watch their calving and foaling operations. So they're all different. There are a lot of different groups within each segment. And so it doesn't really change it, but then what we're doing is we're adding to it. So we're trying to
Mm.
ensure that what we have been doing well, we continue to grow, and then we test that in other segments of those industries. So you'll see on the site where we started to add solutions and landing pages for different solutions within the ag market, and we're preparing to roll some of those out in some of the other segments like construction and job site surveillance.